Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. It is my distinct pleasure today to have with me Neil Swidey. Did I pronounce that right?
Swidey.
Swidey. Neil Swidey. And Neil has recently published a book called Trapped Under the Sea. Did I get that right?
You did.
Okay. He has graciously taken some time from his very busy schedule to come on to our podcast and visit with us today about some of the lessons that he learned on leadership and management of risk in not only researching but writing the book Trapped Under the Sea. I'd like to welcome you to the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.
It's great to be here, Thomas. Thanks for having me.
Could you tell our audience a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book?
Sure. So I'm a staff writer for the Boston Globe magazine here in Boston. And what that means is I sink down into different topics and find what's interesting about a story, spend some time figuring out the right people to talk to. And often then, after writing an in-depth story, I like to move on. This book, Trapped Under the Sea, started as a magazine story 5 years ago, and I found it so compelling and the real-life characters at the center of it so riveting that I didn't want to move on afterwards. So I sunk down into it, and 5 years later have produced a book about it.
One of the things I found interesting was how you even found out about this, because living in or near Boston, certainly writing for the Globe, I would have thought this was a very high-profile event at the time it happened, and yet I think you found out about it some years later, really at a cocktail party.
Yeah, it was actually a birthday party for one of my daughters, one of her friends, and I was talking with another dad there, and he was asking what I was working on, and I asked him the same. He's a lawyer, and he had been involved in the late-stage civil litigation that came out of this industrial accident that was at the center of this story. But as he started telling me the outlines to it, I was struck by my ignorance of this story. And come to find out, I wasn't the only journalist who didn't know. This story it escaped a lot of attention for two reasons. One, it happened on the same weekend, 15 years ago, that John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane went down. So that was a huge story here in Boston. It was a huge story around the world. The son of Camelot and the latest Kennedy tragedy. So the entire focus of the media was on that, rather than what was happening at the center of this story, which takes place, and this is the other reason why people didn't know about it, because it was so remote where this happened. It takes place at the end of a 10-mile tunnel that's built hundreds of feet below the ocean. A tunnel at its end is not only starved of oxygen, pitch black, but has a space of about 30 inches wide, where commercial divers were sent to the moon, essentially, and asked to do the impossible. And so they had never spoken publicly, and very few people knew what happened there. So that added to my interest in this story. One was just that piece of this incredibly riveting narrative that takes place so far from civilization. But then, and this is probably more interesting to your viewers, it was the incredible lessons about leadership and about management and about risk, human risk, and about doing great things and big, ambitious things, and about the people who actually have to do that. All those things came together in this book, and that's why, as you can imagine, it's been so compelling a story, and why it's held my attention for so long, and why I'm very gratified that people are connecting with it as well.
I'm down here in Houston, Texas, and I have to admit I had not heard of this project before I read about your book. Can you describe for the viewers what the project was? You described it as an industrial accident, and several other terms, but if maybe they understood the scope of what the project was.
Absolutely. So let me take you back to 1988. Your viewers might remember the presidential campaign between your Texan, George H.W. Bush, and a guy from Massachusetts who was governor, Mike Dukakis. They were running, and at one point, George Bush and his campaign stumbled on a very effective TV ad, and it was pretty much just footage of Boston Harbor. Boston Harbor, of course, was the place where so much of the history of this country began, where the colonists dumped tea for the Boston Tea Party. But it had become, over the centuries, an open sewer. Human waste was just dumped into the harbor, as was happened in many urban harbors around the country. And this footage that the Bush campaign ran was so devastating because it was real. It showed how bad it had become. Boston Harbor had become the filthiest harbor in America. Fast forward now to today, Boston has the cleanest urban harbor in America. It's an incredible renaissance and success story, environmental cleanup of a massive scale. And it all happened because of this project, which was a harbor cleanup project. And the centerpiece was a two-pronged sewage treatment process. The first part was creating a massive sewage treatment plant. That's visible. So if you fly in and out of Boston, you've probably seen it. It has these giant egg digester tanks. That treats the sewage. So any toilet that flushes in the state pretty much ends up at this one spot. The part that's invisible that most people don't know is this outfall tunnel that starts on an island north of Boston. It goes down 420 feet, and then it goes out for 10 miles underneath the ocean. And then at the very end of this tunnel, this long horizontal tunnel, it connects with these 55 vertical pipes, and those climb up to the ocean floor. And that's how this treated wastewater is diffused and sent out into the wide open waters of the Atlantic Ocean. That's the process that was built. That project, which took 10 years to complete and attracted some of the best engineering and construction firms in the country, built this and made this renaissance possible of the harbor and of Boston and of the region, and made this massive environmental cleanup possible. But what happened in one of the dramas of the book is what happened at the very end. These best and brightest minds couldn't figure out one key part of the job, and so they turned in desperation to a team of commercial divers and asked them to do the impossible.
I'm also a recovering trial lawyer, and I defended corporations in catastrophic injury cases. And I now help companies comply with a law that prevents bribery and corruption overseas. But I see a lot of similarities between the change companies made in safety in the 80s and 90s with trying to comply with this law now. And that was really the genesis of why I was so attracted to your book, and I asked you to come on the show. So with that introduction, you've said a couple of things on the record that have really struck me. One was that accidents tend to happen at the end of a project. And from my perspective, I would say as the reward gets higher, the risk increases. Whether that risk is a risk of safety, whether it's a risk of financial risk, whether it's a risk of Lance Armstrong wanting to, or excuse me, that reward is to win 7 tours. If it's a very high reward, there's some high risk somewhere. And you've clearly articulated at the end of a massive construction project, there's a very high reward. The glass ring is very close. So you point that out. And the other phrase you used is when the Swiss cheese holes all line up. So could you tell us what you meant by those two concepts?
Sure. So for the first one, this was a discovery for me. I went in thinking, as I think probably most people do, that what do you think the most dangerous day on a big construction job is, or a big project of any breathtaking scale? And you think the beginning, right? That's when people are getting to know their jobs, getting to know each other, and working together. But it turns out the data doesn't show that. The data shows the most dangerous day on the job is at the end. So why does that happen? The analogy I use in the book is one that most homeowners might be able to relate to, and that's cleaning your gutters. So if you want to go on a Sunday afternoon and figure out, okay, I've got to clean the gutters here. It happens more up here in New England where we have a lot of leaves falling. You start by climbing up your extension ladder and cleaning out one part of the gutter and then the other part, and then dutifully climbing back down and moving that ladder 4 feet and going back up and climbing around. And you're being cautious. You're being cautious for 2 reasons. You're getting to know the project, and you're sort of being sensible. You don't want to fall. But what happens? At the end of that job, cleaning the gutters, when you're on the final run of the work, and you want to go in and watch the football game, what do? You reach just a little bit farther out there, because you want to get done, as you say, that ring is there, and that might be the football game or a beer or just finishing this job. But the other thing is, you are feeling a little cockier because you haven't had any negative impact all along the way. And this is a term called normalization. So the longer you do something without suffering a negative impact, the less likely you are to sense the risk involved. And that happens on these massive, so extend that metaphor of the cleaning the gutters to these massive projects where there are deadlines, where there are cost overruns, where there's all kinds of stress to finish jobs. And at the end, people are more likely to take those risks than they are at the beginning. And that's both on the worker level and on the manager level and on the corporation level. So you have to be aware of those things. And I think that's one of the things that I came away looking at this quite differently. The other one you mentioned is the Swiss cheese model, which is something people in business have talked about, but it shows up so clearly here in this story. And this is the idea that when something bad happens, something catastrophic happens, when the Challenger blows up and NASA has to figure out how that happened, there's often a desire to find one big cause for that. And usually, when you go back and do the forensics on it, it's not one big thing. It's a series of small failures, any one of which wouldn't be enough to cause this massive catastrophe, but it's when all the holes in the Swiss cheese align perfectly that you get this really horrible outcome. So what does that mean? That means you have to be more, if you're running a project or if you're working on a project, you have to be more aware of that and not just fail to, not just avoid the big mistakes, but you have to avoid the small mistakes because you know that they can cascade and lead to something very bad.
I'd like to turn to some of the thoughts you have on leadership based upon the book. A couple of things struck me in the reviews I've read. The first one was the number of leaders involved. So, for instance, we had a federal judge. We had a representative heading the the Massachusetts Governmental Authority. We had the head of the contractors. The company contracted to build it. And then we had the individual who came up with the untested method of supplying air to the individual divers who were going into the hole. So we had a lot of different folks there. And then contrasting that with the specific leadership style that you talked about with the gentleman who developed the allegedly cutting-edge technology to send the air down. Can you talk about the leadership lessons that you drew from your research?
Absolutely. And in this case, in this book and in this story, there are models of both kinds of leadership that you can draw from, the good and the bad. So the bad are how does it come to the end of this multi-billion-dollar project that had the best and the brightest minds in the field, making a host of good decisions for years on this, project, a mega project of breathtaking scale that ultimately is successful. How does it come at the end to such bad decisions that have such costly consequences? And that happens with organizational behavior and parties not getting along, and often when the driving concern is risk, but not just risk, but protecting yourself against risk and your party against risk and offloading that risk onto other parties, that can pervert the whole process, and it can sort of increase the likelihood of bad decisions being made. So at the end of this job, these parties, because of such tension, because of such financial pressure and calendar pressure to get this job done under this federal court order, they've stopped really talking to each other. The designer, the contractor, the owner, if you can imagine just like building a house, when the architect and the contractor and the homeowner aren't talking together, you're not going to get a good house. So at the end of this project, they weren't talking together. They couldn't figure out. The trust of these parties went down, and when trust goes down, creativity goes down. And so at the end of this, they had a very difficult job. They needed creativity to be at the highest, and they couldn't do that because of those problems on there. So what did they do? They offloaded it to another party, and there's always this seductive appeal of the outsider to come in and save the day. And that has two things in it. One, it's someone's got to be smarter than us, but also that the risk goes to that other party rather than you. You sort of offload the risk onto a new party. That creates, and then when, as you said, the project manager and engineer who came up with this plan, because the location in the end of this tunnel was so remote, they had to devise a new, first of its kind method to give breathing apparatus to these divers going to the moon underneath the ocean. This was a brilliant engineer, but he had very low emotional intelligence, so he couldn't get the best out of his team. And when these divers were telling him the project wasn't working and things weren't ready for prime time, he didn't want to hear it. He kind of closed in rather than pulling that talent and those years of experience from these divers who were doing the actual work and devising a better plan. So those are the bad examples. The solution to this, because ultimately this thing happened, even after some divers were tragically lost, was an example of good leadership in that the leader of the governmental agency that was in charge of this project said after the tragedy of losing divers, we're going to put aside all our financial concerns for now. We're not going to worry about who's going to pay for this. We're going to find the best solution. We're going to test it, and we're going to do it right, and then we'll work out the payment issues. And that's what happened, and that was strong, powerful leadership out of a crisis. And it's just a shame that it couldn't have happened before the crisis to have saved these lives.
Neil, this has really been a fascinating interview for me. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. The lessons that you have imparted in your book, in your interviews, both in print and video, are extremely important, not only in safety, not only in risk management, not only in organizational behavior, but even in my world, the FCPA compliance world. I hope people will buy your book. I'm sure you do as well. It is Trapped Under the Sea. I know it's available on Amazon.com, but I'm sure it's available at local bookstores by now. I look forward to really not only your additional comments on this, but where you may take a lot of the concepts that you've developed here in your work going forward. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming on board. And if the audience wanted to email or find out more about the book, where would they go?
So I've enjoyed being here, and thanks for having me, and enjoyed your work as well on this. The best place to go is trappedunderthesea.com. It's got video and background and contact information and lots of material about the book.
And I would also encourage people to go there because I went there in preparation for this chat, and there's a lot of material, other interviews that Neil has given that I think really fill out a larger flavor of what risk management is, particularly in the context of NASA. I found we didn't even get to that, and I found your whole NASA discussion and what your research and indeed how you incorporated that into some of your thoughts going forward. So I would encourage people to go to that site. Once again, I'd like to thank you very much. And if you have any questions for me, I'm at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report.